Let's continue the series of lectures in astrobiology. The next lecture is by Dr. Mario Di Pinna. He finished his undergrad in the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, where we overlapped for a couple of years. And he went to do his PhD at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, at the City University, in systematic in evolutionary biology. And from then, he's now a professor at the University of São Paulo, and right now he's a visiting professor, researcher at the Museum of Natural History, Paris. If we can say one word of a little bit about the rationale of having a pure zoologist in an astrobiology conference is because of the word biology. Ted already did some introduction to the subject, but even though, despite the fact, and the zoologist here, please excuse, I'm going to say that, despite the fact that evolutionary biology is a very well-developed science with a set of very good laws and theories, as good as physics. Generally, there is, being an astronomer, a physicist and astronomer, I know that there's an incredible big ignorance from the physics side about what zoologists do, or biologists do. And this is a minus, not just because ignorance in general is bad, but also because since they have this very well-established theories, they are ubiquitous. They may be universal to many different places where life could have appeared, and therefore they can guide, for example, in the sample selection of target planets they're going to be looking at, or direct pretty much the mechanisms, the techniques for actually telling you if what you found is life or not. And Tad actually briefly mentioned some of the examples and some of the debates about looking at some rock that has some morphological aspect that looks like life and so on. So I'll pass the word to Mario, and I hope this computer is already functioning.
Thank you, Renato, for the introduction. Very timely, actually. Let me see if this thing works. Okay, can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. So thanks for the introduction, and thanks also to all the organizers for inviting me. This is a very interesting occasion. I have to admit that this is a very different audience from my usual fare. I'm used to talking about evolution to the two extremes of people in society, to people who work on evolution, I mean my colleagues in the field, and people who know nothing about science at all. So this this audience is a bit different because it's people who work on science but not on evolution. So it's kind of an intermediate terrain I'm not very used to. So the first thing I would like to do is to ask how many people here are astronomers or physicists or, yeah, okay, and how many are biologists? There are some, okay, all right, interesting. So I cannot get away with mistakes in any of the two areas, right? I should really be careful with what I say. Not too much BS. Yeah. Anyway, this first class, this first lecture, is going to be sort of a way of sensing. What is this?
Yes, to press here. Change
Not. Okay. In the laser?
Yeah.
Is it in the middle? Okay, this one's right. Thank you very much, Marcelo. So this first lecture is going to be like for me to sense exactly in which direction you're going to go in the next 3 lectures. So we're going to be talking today about some general aspects of evolutionary biology. That's actually my mission here, as Renato mentioned in his introduction. I'm here as the oddball, the biologist. I'm not an astronomer. I'm not particularly involved in the origin of life or anything like that. I'm an evolutionary biologist who works on animals, things that's very far away from the origin of life. But the mechanisms involved in the evolution of higher forms of life are pretty much the same that acted in the beginning. Ted when he, in one of his slides, he mentioned several, I think 6 items. And the last one was, then you have life, inheritance, and natural selection. Okay, that's where I start. I don't start before that. I need biological systems to talk about. So what's the relevance of this for a course in astrobiology? The relevance is based on a hope. Or actually not just a hope, I'm being too pessimistic. It's more like an expectation that the general principles of evolutionary biology, I mean really general, the principles that natural selection will work on any system that behaves in a lifelike manner will be the same throughout the universe. Of course, you cannot be sure about that because there is no other life for us to compare. But the general laws of evolution will probably apply anywhere in the universe where you find things that we qualify as organized life. Of course, you can go on the definition of life forever, and this is not my objective here, but let's say what most people see as life will probably have been the result of things that act in a manner similar to what we call natural selection, and of course other subsidiary concepts in evolutionary biology. So evolutionary biology is something that people who work on astrobiology have to know how life on this planet evolved, what are the laws that control and that guide the evolution of living beings on this planet. So that's my mission here, is giving you guys an idea of how the basic principles of evolution work. But secondary to that, there is also another objective, which is not just to inform about evolution, but also to clean up the field in your minds about things you have heard in the past about evolution. Not to the biologists, of course. I'm talking here more about the non-biologists, because the exposition they've had to biology has been not as strong, not as broad. So we need actually to correct a few of the things that are very widespread but very wrong about evolutionary biology first. And also inform a little bit about the history of the ideas in evolution, how they began. Because this is also something that most people misinterpret, which is a major cause for, in the end, not understanding biological evolution very well. So this first class will have a lot of history, because, well, I like history, and I think understanding a subject is also understanding its history. And at the same time, I am trying to dispel some myths about evolution, especially about the genesis of the idea of evolution. And the first one is already here. It relates to this man. Everybody knows him, Charles Darwin. Everybody associates Darwin with evolution because he's truly the creator of the idea. But we have to remember that he did not start from scratch. He did not start from nothing. There are lots of ideas about evolution already circulating in the intellectual environment of his time, and very much before, as we will see. We'll get back to Darwin many times in this lecture and many others, but now I want to talk a little bit about how people understood the world before Darwin, how people saw diversity of life, the complexity of life, and the structure of life, the order of life, before we understood evolution. Was there anything there before Darwin that was reminiscent of evolution in some way? And if we dig into history, we find that yes, there are many ideas which were already proto-evolutionary in the 1500s. Actually, we could go back as far as the classical Greeks. There are people in ancient Greece that talked about evolution in some way. They tried to explain why there are so many different kinds of animals and so many different kinds of plants. Is this related to history one way or another? But I don't want to go that deep in history. I want to start a little bit earlier. And if we go to the 16th century, now let's see if this works. This is the right one, right? Okay, forward.
Yeah.
No, it's here. Okay. This is a guy who lived in the 16th century, 1500s. And he was a natural historian, a naturalist of sorts. And at this time, people are beginning to discover several things in the world which are not fitting in with what they thought was the organization of the world. They were discovering that things were more complicated than they thought. And one of them was the structure of living beings. For example, this guy published the first comparison of a skeleton anywhere in Western literature, actually anywhere, probably in literature in general. The left is the skeleton of a person, and the right one is the skeleton of a bird. And he compared the two, even giving similar names or similar codes to equivalent bones. Like you see, he's using the same letters to designate equivalent bones. Not always, but most times. What did he discover with that? Why did he find this is so interesting? Because he thought, well, there's an equivalence of parts there. Why is that? I mean, why you have the same bone being modified in several different animals? So different as a bird and a human. What's the logic before that? It shouldn't be like that. If things are created, they should be similar in some ways, but not in this way. Like you always have an equivalent part here and there, or something new showing up here and there. Why is this? Why living beings should be so structured in this particular manner? Of course, there's nothing about evolution then, so this was completely new for him. Other people, at about the same, not the same century, but around the same time, compared to the history of human knowledge, were also realizing that there were other things that were a bit strange. For example, this guy realized that things could be organized hierarchically. Living beings could be organized in a classification that was hierarchical, and it was not Aristotelian. The Aristotelian classification was having bone, not having bone, with a backbone, without a backbone, with hair, without hair, things like that. So it was always two things. And people were beginning to discover that the natural world was more complex than that. It could not always be organized as in this celestial order of things, in which everything fits here or there. No, it was much more complicated than that. People were beginning to realize that. We can go on to several people working at the same time, or more or less the same time, reaching similar conclusions. How many people have heard about this guy, Benoit de Maillet? Nobody, right? This guy is incredibly interesting, really a character in the history of science. He realized something very important from today's perspective. He discovered that the world was probably billions of years old. Was the first person who thought about it. At this time, everybody thought the world was like a few thousand years old, not much more than that. And he realized that the world should be orders of magnitudes older than that. How did he do that? He saw that some mountains, very high mountains, have sedimentary layers, kilometers above the surface of the sea. So he decided to make a simple calculation. He got historical records of the drying of a lake, and a few centimeters per year. He got the historical records and made the calculation. How long it would take for that highest mountain that he knew at the time, that had sedimentary layers on top, to go all the way to its base. He came up to, I don't remember the exact number, but 1.7 billion years. So his findings in general were so outrageous for the time that he never published them. He wrote everything and asked people to publish it after his death, under a pseudonym. The pseudonym is, I mean, it's not a big mystery, it's just his name, backwards, de Maillet. Well, he was already dead anyway, so, and it's just conversations with an Indian philosopher. So he exposes very interesting views there about the origin of life, the origin of the universe, and the age of the universe, the age of the earth, going completely against the religious establishment of the time. No wonder he asked that this was published only after his death. Actually, he didn't show it to anyone. He just gave a package to a friend when he was about to die. I published this after him dead. It's very interesting. It's so rich. I mean, this time is so rich. People are beginning to understand the world was not like they thought it was. This is well, it looks like about the same time, but actually it made the big difference from the beginning of the 18th century to the second half of the 18th century. The biologists here know this person very well, Carolus Linnaeus. He's the founder of the system of classification, of naming, actually the system of nomenclature that we still use today. And Linnaeus, in his Latinized form, was actually a more hardcore scientist than any of the other characters that I showed here so far. he actually attempted a classification or a general system of classification that would take up the entire universe. Most people think of him as the founder of zoological and botanical nomenclature, but he was actually the founder of general classifications of the universe in general. He was a rather ambitious guy, so his book Systema Naturae is very, very ambitious. He tried to classify everything. Before anybody has any doubt, he was a religious person. He dedicated the book to Jehovah, blah, blah, blah. And this is important for what I'm going to show in a few moments. In 1736, the same Linnaeus made a very interesting discovery. Actually, I was a student of him who discovered a species of plant that did not exist before. This species of plant on a Swedish island was something that he had never seen before. He was sure it was not there before because he knew the area well. He had collected there many times for many years. Then suddenly there comes this new thing that no one had seen before. Let me go to the next one. Well, this is a saying from one of his books that he puts in many books of his. I won't try to pronounce the Latin here, but this is what it says in Portuguese. In English, is there are as many species as are the types initially created by the infinite being. Okay. He believed that in special creation of species. The species were created as they are, okay? After a certain number of editions in the Systema Naturae, he dropped this from the beginning of his book. He didn't say anything. I mean, guys in this time were not very explicit. They just did things. You had to interpret what that meant. So he dropped this sentence. Okay, we immediately led to, well, you probably didn't believe it very much. What happened? That plant, this is the original form, and this is the new form that appeared. This thing began to crack the solidity of his beliefs and the created nature of species, because it was a really, really strange case. Linnaeus was a very keen observer. He was a very good naturalist. He was a scientist in the modern sense of the word, although he was, of course, constrained by his time and by the limitations of his time. But he was a scientist in more or less a modern sense. Look what he said about this plant that he called Peloria, the new one that appeared on that island. I will translate to English, okay? This new plant, Peloris, propagates itself by means of its own seed. And consequently, it is a new species that did not exist since the beginning of the world. It is a new genus never in existence until the moment. It is a hybrid species in the in the plant kingdom. Okay, hybrid we have to understand in the context what he means hybrid. It's not what we mean hybrid today. This was in a letter. Later, he began to see many cases like that. And he concluded, plants of hybrid origin are many, and open the door for one of the great natures, the great rooms of nature, but it is a door that will not open without cracking. So he realized that there was something really wrong with the fixist view of species. Now, let's see how this influenced his actual work, because these statements are statements in letters and in conversations. They're not actually published in his works. Going back to later editions of the Systema Naturae, we can see the breadth of what he wanted to convey. For example, he tries to classify God. So if you see God and read this and it fits, it's God. You saw in the street. The world, the aster, how do they say that in English? The stars and things, planets, elements, earth, nature, and so on. He tried to classify really everything, mineral, universe, and mythical beings. And he goes on to every little species of the planets, known until then. It's incredible. I mean, he tried really to classify everything. I could never do that today. I mean, one person would be completely impossible. And he goes on to animals. So one of the chapters, he goes on to mammals, many species of mammals, primates, and here is the chapter on primates, Homo. And he goes on following his logic. The logic is purely based on fact, on similarities that he sees in the structure of organisms. It has nothing to do with any preconceived notions about evolution or religion or anything. He just classifies things based on characters. Eventually, he reaches Homo, that's in the genus Homo, and this is one of the species, Homo troglodytes, which happens to be, troglodytes is the chimpanzee. There is, of course, there is a little nomenclatural problem here. This actually refers to the orangutan, probably, but he's one of the great apes. So he had no doubt when he was classifying things based on actual data that the apes should be together with us. He just put it there. That's how it is. Homo includes several species. One of them is us. I mean, this is the 1800s. It's quite spectacular. And then people complained. I mean, you didn't need to write too much to cause controversy in those times. So Gmelin, another naturalist, complained to him, how dare you include monkeys with us? I mean, this is wrong in so many levels. We better not even talk about it. And he replied to Gmelin, and he said, it didn't please you that I placed men among the anthropomorpha, well, the ape-like things, men-like things. Perhaps due to the term with human form. How do I go back? Okay, with human form. But man, well, this is his style, learns to know things by himself. Let's not argue about words. The situation would be the same to me, whichever the chosen word. I only want someone to demonstrate a generic difference between men and the simians that comes from the principles of natural history. I don't know any, absolutely. That anyone show me one. If I had called man a simian or vice versa, I would have united all the theologians against me. Perhaps I should have done that in respect to the laws of our discipline. That's interesting, isn't it? This guy was not an evolutionist, but he began to realize that the world was not fitting very well with the observations. So we needed some, well, actually, he didn't even see these things. I mean, the bonobos, which are very similar to us, really, to a scare, alarming degree. He only saw skeletons and skin and things like that. He concluded by actually looking at the details of the bones and the remains he had preserved. Not too much, but it's quite impressive. Of course, he didn't, much less he saw this one. This is a chimp with alopecia. It also afflicts them. That disease that all the hairs fall off. It gets very, very similar to a person. He didn't see any of these things, so all the details are really technical. It's not the impression he had of similarity. It was actually details of anatomy. But there are other people. Notice, the myth I'm trying to dispel here is that evolution is an idea produced by one brain in the history of our species. It is not. Evolution is an idea that was gradually achieved by the accumulation of observations and thought. And eventually, we had Darwin, who synthesized everything, who amassed a huge amount of data and came up with the theory of evolution. But the ideas were there. The accumulation of facts was leading to the idea of evolution. For example, this guy, Louis Moreau de Maupertuis, yes, that's how you pronounce this. He was a French thinker, and at this time we can only talk about thinkers rather than specific sciences and disciplines. He came up with something which is quite similar to evolution by natural selection, almost 200 years before Darwin, or about 200 years before Darwin. It was there. This is a translation, of course. You have to make allowances for the different style of the times. But he's talking about, I'm not going to read all this, but he's talking about how within a population of animals, he's talking about animals, some individuals will fit better conditions than others. And as time goes by, this will make a difference on survival. You have differential survival, which eventually will lead to very different forms from the ones we started with. This is evolution by natural selection. And we are talking 1756. If you want to stay a bit closer to philosophers, Immanuel Kant is still in the 1700s, so we're not even talking about the 19th century here. He, in one of his works, he said this, this analogy of forms strengthens the supposition that there is a real relation of, a real blood relation between them, due to the derivation of one common genitor, common progenitor, common ancestor. A supposition to which we arrive by the observations of the gradual approximation of one class of animals to the other. So to someone who was not even very much linked to natural history. Evolution was also something that was beginning to form as a good explanation to the phenomena of life. We can go a little bit further. We have Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. This is the actual, this is the death mask. Sorry, I couldn't read it. There's so much in the internet today, it's very hard to. This is a statue. I don't think he looked like that, but anyway. It's a statue in Chicago to him. Okay, this is a skeleton. Many people associate him only with his theatrical masterpieces, like Faust and things like that. But he was also a very gifted naturalist. Many people don't know. He wrote many papers on anatomy and on the metamorphosis of plants, for example, which became classics for many years. This is 1790. And he was not only prone to observation, but he was also very keen on making theories about these observations. And eventually he came up, so this is just another example of that, work on morphology. He was what they call a polymath. He knew everything that was to be known at the time, in his time. He was really a smart person. And worked very hard, apparently, because he wrote so much about everything. But he had books on morphology in which he also noticed, well, there is something strange here. We have too many correspondences between parts of animals for this to be due to chance. There must be some underlying explanation. Something is there that we need to discover. He didn't know what it was. He speculated with transformism, which was the idea of evolution, how it was called at the time, and didn't come to a theory of evolution, but came close. And he made some theories that are still valid today, like the segmental theory of the skull. The bones of the skull are formed by modified vertebrae at the tip of the vertebral column, which is still more or less correct today. You know, the skull is partly segmentary. It's just that the bones modified so much that they are no longer recognized as parts of the vertebral column in the adult. They are in the juveniles, however. Anyway, if we go to other countries, we see that there are people talking about correspondences and evolution in many Western European countries. For example, Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, he was also an evolutionist of sorts. And we are talking still 1700s, 1800s. This is all before Darwin. And all these people are talking about it. I won't go into the details, but he had the principle of connections, which basically was his way of synthesizing the correspondences that you see among living beings. You know, of course, at the time, he was doing that to bones and morphological parts of organisms, but it applies just as well today if you go into DNA bases when you're comparing things. The principle is the same. You find equivalences, and these equivalences mean something. They have to mean something. He didn't know what it was. He speculated with evolution. I won't go into the details because there is no need for that. This is Lamarck. Now we're getting into more familiar territory. Lamarck is usually portrayed as the guy who didn't get it, like the loser who didn't understand it right. But we perhaps should change that a little bit. Lamarck was a very brilliant person, in fact. He is a very profound observer and theoretician about the phenomena of life, about biology in general. He wrote his more synthetic book is Philosophie Zoologique. He wrote several books, and he came up, after looking at all the evidence, he came up with an idea that things on this planet, living things on this planet, evolved. What does it mean to evolve? Evolve is to have a history of descendants with modification. So things diverge over time. People are beginning to get to this conclusion. Life is diverse because it became diverse with time. It did not appear diverse. And this is the central idea of evolution. Not the explanation of evolution, but the central idea of what evolution is. There is a history of diversification. And Lamarck got to that. Of course, he tried to come up with a mechanism to explain how evolution worked. And that's where things didn't go very right for him. Oh yeah, in France he's not, he's revered in France. Okay, this is a statue of him in the Jardin des Plantes, and it's difficult to read, but here it's the founder of the doctrine of evolution in French. So, yes, he came up with the idea before everybody in a synthetic way. But what's wrong with him? Many people think that Lamarck is wrong because he believes in the inheritance of acquired characteristics. This is not true. He actually believed in the inheritance of acquired characteristics, but he was not the only one. Everybody at that time believed in that, including Darwin. So this is not the reason why he's wrong. The reason why his theory is wrong, I mean the details of the workings of evolution, is that he believed that life evolves along tracks, predetermined tracks. For example, this graph here, it actually explains a little bit how his theory was. He believes that there is a spontaneous generation all the time. So life pops up in very simple forms. As soon as it originates, it begins to evolve, begins to change. And it changes over time until it reaches the more complex forms of life. So if something originated or popped up to life, spontaneous generation, a long time ago, it had time to evolve into the most complex life forms. But if it appeared today, it's still, that little thing there that's not complex at all. And that explains why you see things at the same time, living together, at all levels of organization, from microorganisms to very complex animals. So, but his theory postulates that the track was always the same. It originated and followed a predetermined route. This is where he was wrong. He did not realize the branching nature of evolution. He realized evolution must have occurred, but he didn't quite get the right structure. The shape of evolution eluded him. One person that was all very important historically, but many people don't know, this is Erasmus Darwin. He's the grandfather of Charles Darwin. And he was a physician and natural philosopher and a writer and a poet and several different things. And he was very influential on Darwin. He wrote, especially because this little book, Zoonomia, or the Laws of Organic Life. They never met. He died before Darwin was born, but his writings in his library are very influential on Darwin's ideas. Erasmus was he was very distrustful of mystical explanations of nature. He believed nature had just a causal physical explanation, the whole of nature, and that we should struggle to understand how the world works without resort to magic. So he actually had a rationalistic point of view on things on explanations. And he wrote this book. It is interesting because it's on poetry. It's not on prose. I wonder how much it would take for us to publish a scientific paper today on poetry form. I don't even know which was the last one, but he did. He was publishing it himself, so he didn't mind. So it's a long poem on how life came to be, what happened. And there is the germ of natural selection, the germ of evolution there. And young Charles Darwin read that. It's an interesting situation because he was very famous, both as a medical doctor and as a poet and as a philosopher, several different things. And of course, Charles Darwin, his grandson, is also very famous and was famous in life. So, what happened to the father of Charles Darwin? He used to say, well, when I was young, this is the father of Charles Darwin. I was known for being the son of my father. Now I'm known for being the father of my son. He never did anything. Oh, he got rich. That's why Darwin never had to work. So he was useful. But if we want to stay within the environment of England, Victorian England, we also find very interesting characters there too, thinking exactly the same thing. This guy, Patrick Matthew, wrote this book. It doesn't look like much when you look at it. It's a naval timber and arboriculture. It's a book about woods for constructing ships. This is 1829 or something like that. I have to figure out here the Roman things. Yeah, 31. Okay. He wrote this book, and he was discussing, well, sometimes we can improve the quality of wood by making selective breeding, selective cultures of trees. So you have a tree that has a very, very nice properties, those few individuals are very good for what you want to do with that wood. So what you do, you take seeds from them, plant them together, and you wait for the next generation. Then everybody will inherit those desirable characteristics, and you end up having a whole population with those characteristics. Then, if you want still more pronounced characteristics that you find useful, you select those best few specimens and do the same process again. If you do that over and over again, you get a very nice type of wood to make ships or whatever you want to do with them. And then he just adds, and by the way, maybe the same process explains life on this planet. Let's go on to sailing. Let's go on to sailing ships. And he just says, he came to this conclusion and then said, this may be a universal law, but he didn't elaborate. When the origin of species came about, he became very disgruntled. He became angry. He said, well, I had this idea before. He actually wrote a note to a scientific journal at the time. I will not read all this, but he's complaining. This is a quote from his book, actually. And this is the complaint. Okay, this is the complaint. In your number, this is worth reading a little bit more. In the number of March 3rd, I observe a long quotation from the Times stating that Mr. Darwin professes to have discovered the existence and modus operandi of natural law of selection. That is, the power in nature takes the place of man and performs a selection, sua sponte, in organic life. This discovery, recently published as the results of 20 years investigation and reflection by Mr. Darwin, turns out to be what I published very fully and brought to apply practically to my first in my work, blah, 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 blah. And reviewed many times and blah, 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 blah. Okay, Darwin replied to that. Darwin's a very nice man. I mean, he was independently wealthy. He didn't have to fight for funds or money or anything. So he could be honest in a very broad way and very generous. I mean, his book doesn't explain much. It's just, okay. But Darwin said, I have been much interested by Mr. Patrick Matthews' communication in the number of your paper dated April 7th. I freely acknowledge that Mr. Matthews has anticipated by many years the explanation which I have offered of the origin of species under the name of natural selection. I think that no one will feel surprised that neither I nor apparently any other naturalist had heard of Mr. Matthews' views, considering how briefly they are given, and that they appeared in appendix to a work on naval timber. I can do no more than offer my apologies to Mr. Matthews for my entire ignorance of his publication. If another edition of my work is called for, I will insert a notice to the foregoing effect. And he did. Next edition, he says, yeah, Mr. Matthews had pretty much the same idea. And he's not the only one. I mean, apparently the idea is popping up in England all over the place. Oh, sorry, this is the repeat. This guy came up to the same idea too. Edward Blyth, he was working in India at the time. He was a naturalist, a traveling naturalist. He wrote things that are pretty much natural selection and evolution, and the same mechanism that Darwin discovered. I don't know what was happening in England at the time. Well, we may speculate. There are people who speculate on why natural selection came up independently so many times in Victorian England. And some of these explanations are probably right, but I won't go into such details. But he came to pretty much the same conclusions. This guy too, William Wells, is also considered to be a precursor of the idea of natural selection and evolution, also English. It's really curious. Many people discovered the same thing at the same time. So where is Darwin in all this? Well, does he deserve all the credit he has as founder of evolution by natural selection? Absolutely, absolutely. Because none of these other authors ever did the kind of work that he did. He actually approached the subject scientifically. He looked for evidence in every type of organism, in every continent on us that he could get his hands on. He made experiments that took many, many years. I mean, most of his life he was doing experiments that had some importance to natural selection and evolution. So it was a work that was orders of magnitudes beyond anything that had been done before. And if we can say there is a ground zero to evolutionary biology, this ground zero is 1859, publication of the Origin of Species, no doubt about it. That's when evolution became a science. So he deserves the credit. Okay, the Darwin industry the biologists probably know what I'm talking about. There's this thing called the Darwin industry. It's people who make money out of Darwin year after year. for 150 years already. And it's called the Darwin industry. You write anything about Darwin, it's going to sell. Any piece of crap. So there's the Darwin industry. They want to publish everything, so they get money. So this is some people get a little irky about it. Okay, no, enough of Darwin. No. But anyway, he is as important as people say he is. This, of course, is the page of his notebook, where for the first time he correlates diversity with descent. This was never published in this form, of course. This is the famous I think. There are many posters with that. And he shows how, or he tries to explain to himself, this was just his personal notebook, how when you have separate groups here, they may have been the results of a process of diversification, of branching, or descent with modification. So this illustration is very famous because of that. There's some explanation, some scribble here. Of course, the ideas are synthesized in his book, which he always presented as just an abstract of his ideas. The real ideas would come later in a much larger book, which never came. I don't think it was necessary at all. And notice that the only illustration in The Origin of Species is this one, which shows a branching diagram, explaining, well, it is actually very important, but it's the only illustration, how current diversity is the result of past events of diversification. So life is a function of time. That's the main conclusion. Of course, Darwin was a lucky man in many ways. Not only he was rich, but he could travel at the right time in his life. When he was very young, he made a trip of the Beagle, where he could visit lots of continents and see lots of things no one else had seen before. But he was also lucky after that. Like a couple of years after the publication of The Origin of Species, this thing was discovered. This is Archaeopteryx lithographica, which is a very interesting animal because it has feathers, but if you take the feathers away, it looks just like a normal reptile, like a little dinosaur. It has a long tail, it has claws here, and here it has fingers, but it's definitely a bird because it has the impressions of feathers. There are other characteristics for birds that we know today, but at the time, this was what brought as a bird. So it came at the right time. Many people thought it was a hoax because the timing was too good to be true. What did it prove? It proved exactly what Darwin was saying. You look at things today, they look very different. But if you go back in time, they get more and more similar until they join and become the same thing. So that's evolution. And this proved it visually to everybody. It was very easy to see. You didn't need to be a specialist or anything. This is a lizard skeleton or dinosaur skeleton with feathers. It's the intermediate that you expect to see when you look back into birds and reptiles. They become more and more similar as you go back. Of course, paleontology was not very developed at the time. Now we have examples like this all over the place. Whichever group of animals and plants you see, there is a very rich fossil record that shows all the intermediates that you need. Even for things as different as whales and the other mammals. For example, we have a modern whale with its nostrils at the top of the skull, and you have an extinct relative of the whales that did not look like a whale at all. It has 4 legs, lived on land. It was just like a big dog. It had the nostrils at the tip of the nose. Okay, very different. But if you if you look at the fossils, you find things that have the nostrils in the middle of the snout, for example. This is everywhere today. But of course, we have the benefits of having a very complete fossil record, right? Several hundred years of paleontological exploration. So the early expectations of Darwin's theory have been amply fulfilled by new discoveries. It's everywhere. Anyway, evolution implies 2 things. Evolution implies what I've been talking about as descent with modification, which means that all living organisms that have a history of descent. Descent with modification. Life is a branching, is the result of a branching process. So this is understanding what evolution is, the pattern of evolution. Evolution is the process that makes ancestral species divide into descendant species, often with an increase in diversity. Of course, there is extinction, so sometimes you can have diversity decrease, but history never rewinds itself. It's extinct, but it's there, it existed. So overall, it's a history of an increase in diversity, either living or extinct. But Darwin also explained how the mechanism works, or he proposed an explanation of how evolution operates to create complexity, and that's natural selection, which is probably the most powerful biological factor anywhere. And this is where the history of evolutionary biology as a mechanism of the study of evolutionary processes begin. Of course, natural selection, as we will see in the next upcoming classes, upcoming lectures, is not the only factor. There are other factors that are important as well. But natural selection is the driving factor of adaptation, which is the most appealing element in the evolutionary process. We'll see that in more detail. But what is natural selection? Natural selection is based on a very simple set of observations about the natural world and how it works. All of them could be done by anybody who liked to observe natural populations. One, individuals in populations show variation. So when you see any population of animals or plants or microorganisms or anything, the individuals in that populations are not all identical. They're all a little bit different from one another. Sometimes reasonably different, sometimes almost identical, but there is variation. They're not clones of one another. So there is variation in every characteristic. Okay, certain of these variations are inheritable. So they're passed from parents to offspring. So they're genetic, they have a genetic basis. They're not just the environment acting upon the organism. So you pass them on. Three, certain heritable variations result in differential reproductive success, which means that certain variations are better for that particular environment, for that particular situation or circumstance than others. Well, obviously these will favor their bearers, which then will survive more, will reproduce more, and will increase their representation in the next generation, which is the conclusion, the corollary of that. Differences in reproductive success due to heritable variation cause changes in the representation of these variations in the population. So over generations, you have a quantitative difference in the frequency of specific characteristics. If you substitute characteristics by genes, you reach the field of population genetics, which developed in the 1930s, 1920s as a subdiscipline of biology, and which became very quantitative eventually. But this is the essence of natural selection. It is a very, very simple principle, but it is also a very powerful principle. It explains life as it is. It explains the complexity of life. Natural selection, once you have living systems that are subject to natural selection, you can't stop it. It will just go on and go on, because natural selection is not something that happens here and there. It's happening all the time. While we speak here, it's happening everywhere. So it's not something that's, oh yeah, it's suffering natural selection now. No. It's happening all the time. It's happening now in deep sea fish living 5 miles under the surface. It's happening now in the bacteria in our stomach, in our intestines. It's happening everywhere. It's just a matter of the time of generation. When the generation is very short, when the generation time is very short, it evolves very fast. When it's very long, it evolves more slowly, just because it takes a while for biology of the population to change. But that's it. It's just a matter of pace, but it's always happening. And it explains, since evolution is a ramifying process, it explains how come you have so many different things and all of them so sophisticated. That's very counterintuitive if you think of it. Think of a mind of a person who thinks that our species is the center of the universe, we're the most important species. Of course, whatever created life, natural or not, invested a lot of effort in us. And then you suddenly see all these other things that are so finely adjusted and so sophisticated that they almost they rival us in terms of the amount of time that would have to be invested on them to create their structure and their other details. Natural selection explains that very easily. Natural selection does not prefer things over others. It just acts on all of them all the time. So things branch, and natural selection goes acting on all of them just equally. So all of them are the results of natural selection to the same degree, which explains the complexity of life. Okay. Of course, we have today many examples. This is the classical example of Piston betiolaria, the moth, the English moth that changed its gene frequency very brutally during the Industrial Revolution. This is a textbook example, of course. You guys all know this very well, I guess, or at least have heard about it. There was this population of moths that mimicked lichen-covered trees. And when the Industrial Revolution began, the trees became like this. Because of the smoke, they became black. Of course, these moths are preyed upon by birds. So looking like the tree is a good thing for them. They survive more. But when the trees change color, a very rare morph, which is actually a very low frequency allele, suddenly became very advantageous. Being black now in that kind of environment was very good, because it couldn't be seen as well, while the other one, the white one, was was very visible. And in a few generations, all the moths were like that, over 90%, just because the other ones were eaten more, and this is inheritable. This is just genetic variation. So it became very frequent. This, of course, we're talking about the Industrial Revolution. How is it today? It became back to this. It's no longer as polluted. The trees are white again because of lichen, and the black form is again very rare in most areas. So we actually have the benefit of more observations. There are some exceptions, actually, very interesting ones, as a matter of fact. Some people notice, this part here has white trees, but a lot of black moths. Why is that? And then people went on to study that and discovered that the wind was taking them from London into that area. So they're just being food for birds. All the little examples, the little exceptions were explained away with more closer observation. So it's a very nice example because it's being followed for such a long time. Although it's a very simple example as well. Of course, natural selection is not the only thing that Darwin did. In fact, if you look in his autobiography, he didn't believe that evolution by natural selection would be his lasting contribution to science. He believed that the theory of pangenesis would be his generic theory of inheritance, which is completely wrong. I mean, nobody talks about it anymore. He thought that this would be secondary, perhaps because he saw that so many other people had the same idea more or less at the same time. But leaving that aside, he has another book that is extremely important for the development of evolutionary biology, which is The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, which is the book that introduces sexual selection. We'll be talking about it in upcoming lectures, but just so you guys know this exists. Sexual selection is a very subtle mechanism, which some people include as a subset of natural selection. That's okay, it's just semantics. But it explains many things that could not be explained by regular natural selection. And it's very interesting. We'll see what this is. Probably the third lecture. Yeah, that's where I put it. And what this means. But it explains a lot of what we are, and explains a lot of what other creatures similar to us are. And some of them are not so similar to us. But it explains away many of the things that we think are counterintuitive when seen from the optics of regular natural selection. We'll talk about this book in more detail later. One other thing that we have to approach before dealing with more technical details about evolutionary biology is how to represent the results of evolution. This is what we're going to be doing tomorrow. It's actually my specialty. I'm a systematic biologist. How you reconstruct evolutionary relationships and how you express them. Strangely, this second part, which looks a bit simpler at first sight, took over 100 years after Darwin to be properly dealt with. It came only with this book, The Sexual Translation. The book is from the 1950s, so it's almost practically 100 years after Darwin that people actually understood how to represent evolutionary relationships. We will look into that with some detail tomorrow, but just to get to the right mindset, so it's not completely new tomorrow. The idea is how you represent the results of a process of descendant modification. Let's think about the origin of life. If life originated only once, let's think about its first split. Okay, the first species on this planet, okay? So it divides in two. How does it divide in two? Well, what's the mechanism that leads species to separate and become separate species? Usually it's just isolation. Like one species is on one side of the planet and the other half of that same species is on the other side. So the two do not communicate anymore. And eventually they drift away because they accumulate other differences that the other one will not inherit. They're not in contact anymore. So they become genetically different. And so they gradually drift away. And that's how you get to different species. Usually it's like that. So it's just isolation. Like you have one species that occupied Gondwana. Gondwana is split, and you have, initially, the species looks just the same. But gradually they get different because they don't communicate anymore. So mutations that appear, originate, and get fixed in one continent will not pass to the other. And since these mutations follow not only completely independent routes, but also they respond to different selective pressures, the two get more and more different over time. So that's how we'll go into more detail about this later, but this is how it happens overall. It just drifts away because of isolation. Okay? So let's say you have the first life on Earth that's split in two because of some physical factor, no problem. Could be anything. Could be an environmental factor that it got split in two. Now, this one follows its own path, and that one follows its path as well. And eventually they get very different. Let's say we are talking about eubacteria, that was shown already here in previous lecture, and the other one becomes archaebacteria plus eukaryotes. When we look at them later, we tend to think, well, bacteria and another group that includes us, one of them has a lot more evolution than the other. Why do we think that? Just because they're simpler? One side is simpler. But it's very difficult to talk about simplicity when you're talking about differential survival. I mean, we do not dominate this planet. Bacteria dominate this planet. They're much more successful than we are. They can be very, very successful, very sophisticated, and we don't even know how. They're controlling us all the time. Basically, they made this planet as we see it. Okay. But going back to the technical point, we tend to see one of the sides as being less evolved than the other. This is a mistake. Because if you look at the primitive species that point, the dot, from where the two came, when did this species appear? When it separated from the other one, right? At this point where there is a split. If there is this split, it happened exactly at the same time. So the two sides, the two branches that come out of a node in any evolutionary scenario have exactly the same age, the same time of evolution. So we have as much time of evolution as the bacteria in our gut. We don't have more. Every species on Earth has exactly the same time of evolution. There's no difference in that. It's a mathematical truth. It just comes from the structure of branching and descent modification. Although this may sound obvious after a while, it's not obvious to most people. So this is another myth that we have to dispel about evolution, that certain things are more evolved than others. They're not. They're all the same. They have all the same amount of evolution with no difference. What changes sometimes is the rate of change, but the time is the same. Okay? And time is ultrametric, as we say in relation to graph theory. The time elapsed from this to the tip of the tree is the same as from this to this tip of the tree. Okay, that's called ultrametric. It always adds up to the same number. Okay, just because how we represent it and how it is. It just splits. Amazingly enough, it took 100 years after Darwin for this to be properly understood. We'll see tomorrow more details about that. But this is how evolutionary diagrams look today. Forget about the colors. This is just explaining something that is not is beside the point now. But think just about the black things here, the lines and the names. And evolutionary trees today only have elements at the tips. They don't have elements at the base. These things you see here are not species. They're just names to groups. Okay. So, in my opinion, having your mind straight on how to represent evolution is perhaps the most important element in understanding evolution straight. Understanding what happens, understanding what is the actual phenomenon of evolution. The study of this kind of thing is called phylogeny or phylogenetics. It's part of the bigger field of systematic biology. That's where I work, actually. And one of the consequences of that is this changes very dramatically our way of looking at ourselves. For many years after the evolutionary era, people still thought about the natural world as something organized in a ladder-like manner, with us at the top, and the other, lower things at the bottom. Now we know it's not like that. Ted showed that CD-like phylogenetic tree with 2,000 terminals, and we were just one. He showed a sequence of things until he got to us. We were just one little poop thing there. That's a very nice illustration, actually. It's vectorial, right? So you can magnify it as much as you want and never lose the detail. So this is the correct view. We are one more species in this mess. And we are formed by exactly the same processes. Not only in terms of evolution, natural selection, sexual selection, but also in terms of branching. We just branch according to things that are beyond our control. Of course, we're in the middle of this mess here. These are our closest relatives. And this is where it became very unpalatable in the 19th century for people to accept evolution. Even though Linnaeus had said the same thing 100 years before, people thought this was, no, that's a bit too much. We cannot be included in this mess. No, this doesn't apply to us. And amazingly enough, that still extends to the present, as you'll see. Many people think that evolution is something that applies to biology only, but it's not true. That's why I think the principles of natural selection will be shown to be quite universal once we have access to other biological systems outside of Earth. Let me just control my time here.
Still have 2 minutes.
2 minutes?
20 minutes.
Oh, that's a lot. Oh no, you need time for questions too, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just rush it. It's no problem. If there is something that we can do it tomorrow. How many people here have heard about genetic programming or Darwinian programming? You guys work on that? No. But this is very interesting. This is a means of programming that developed more recently that sophisticates or refines programs based on the principles of natural selection. Because some programs are so complicated, but so complicated today, like tens of thousands of programming lines, and nobody really knows how that thing works. I mean, I bought a computer with Windows 8. It was a mistake. I'm using the computer from this institution because my computer is not reliable enough. Why is that? Because it's so complicated that nobody knows actually the whole program. So if there is a bug, people just, oh, that's another department, sorry. And the other department says, oh, that's only half our responsibility, really. No, this is a little bit here, which is the other guy there. In the end, it's a big mess, and the program simply doesn't work. Genetic programming does the following thing. It puts the program to reproduce and undergo mutation under a specific environment that selects for the best programs in terms of performance. So it just reproduces the program to the billions. Of course, you need, well, you see where these guys work. You need a big environment to do that. And then at the end, since you suffer mutation selection, you have adaptation. Of course, selection is directed. You select the ones that have the best performance under certain conditions. So eventually you have a program which is perfect, has no bugs, no nothing. Nobody knows how it happened because nobody did it. It's just natural selection working on a particular, very specific set of conditions. This is called Darwinian programming or genetic programming, which, I mean, this slide is kind of old. It was very new when I first showed it, but now it's kind of becoming, I mean, there are 2 people here who have heard of it already, so it wasn't the case 5 years ago. Usually nobody had heard of it. So it's becoming more and more common. Genetic programming is becoming very mainstream these days. And if you look at their, well, this deserves a translation, maybe, genetic programming, this is from their site, one of their sites. The automatic synthesis of programs using Darwinian natural selection and biologically inspired operations like recombination, mutation, inversion, duplication, and deletion. If you look at their fluxograms, it's very interesting because there are so many biological terms there. It almost seems like you're looking at a biology textbook. Fitness, a random population, what else? A genetic operation based on fitness, reproduction, copy new population, crossover, the chromosomal thing to increase variation, and so on. Mutation. This is actually from genetic programming. It doesn't even sound at first sight like something outside of biology. Of course, many people have heard about evolutionary medicine, which also became a very hot topic these days. There are workshops, there are even graduate programs on evolutionary medicine, which is based on evolutionary principles, applies evolutionary principles to understand disease and health and see how you can more efficiently treat certain diseases and understand how they evolve. Of course, this is very obvious in epidemiology, because epidemiology is basically following the evolution of some pathological agent. But it's going beyond that. It's going beyond epidemiology and going into our own composition. Say what to expect if such and such conditions are met. So it's a very interesting area as well, and it's an applied area of evolutionary principles. And this is one of my favorites, actually. This is evolutionary fisheries. Fisheries is the science of pesca, fisheries. It's not ichthyology, it's fisheries. It's specifically for the industry of fisheries in general. And this was actually, this new field, evolutionary fisheries ecology or fisheries biology, came as a response to a very interesting phenomenon that was observed for the first time in the cod. People realized, since the cod has been fished for a long time, people realized there were changes in the cod that were strange. Like they were getting smaller and smaller. Most people just stop up. They're getting smaller because they're fishing too much and they don't have time to grow. They catch them before that. But someone a little more careful noticed, no, something else is changing. The size of maturation is changing as well. So they're maturing sexually at smaller and smaller sizes. We're having many dwarf codfish. They're getting small. They actually mature small and reproduce small. Since there's so much data about the cods, because they've been fished for such a long time, it's an important resource for people to make money. They had all these data. So they discovered that actually the maturity size is decreasing. And someone came with a brilliant idea. We're fishing these things selectively. Because we have the net with a certain size mesh that is determined by legislation to let the big ones run away, to catch the big ones and let the small ones run away, we're selecting for specimens that actually mature early. If you have a population of cod, millions of individuals, there is always one or two which will mature very, like in humans. They're very small and they reproduce, they're adults, right? So once you have very intense fishing, you select for those small ones that are not just small because they're young. They're small because they don't grow. So gradually it has been selected to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And it's not a little bit, it's brutally. They're getting really small. Look at the comparisons here. From the 30s, the 70s, and the 2000s, 21st century. And that's how the fields of evolutionary fisheries began. From this particular case. And now it's a big field again. It's a new area of fisheries, evolutionary fisheries. Because people understood that if you don't take selective factors into consideration, or evolutionary factors into consideration, you destroy our fisheries resources very quickly. You're just pushing them into a direction which is not the one we want. Notice, the thing is big, not for no reason. It has selective pressures in the past that's led it to be big. So the strategy of the codfish and many other fish is just to grow as fast as possible so it gets too big for anybody to eat it and then it starts reproducing and lives for a long time. So the thing is to grow as fast as you can, and then you start reproducing. We are putting a selective pressure on these fish, which is exactly the opposite. So obviously they'll not be as efficient. So the stocks just crashed. So that's probably the reason, which showed in this diagram here. Where is my? It has decreased along with the length at 50% maturation probability. So this is just a fisheries thing. And after the moratorium, it began to gradually increase, not only the population, but the maturity size as well. So this is natural selection in action. Some would say artificial selection, just because we are imposing it, but we are actors in that. But it's just natural selection, you're just predators, and we're selecting big ones. So the little ones survive, and they reproduce more. Eventually, everybody's small. So this may be happening to many, many, many fisheries stocks around the world. So today, evolution is not just an academic subject of interest only to evolutionary biologists. It's also a subject of interest to many people in the applied sciences. And there are many books and journals about it. It has become a very dynamic field. This is something that I found. I want someone to explain that to me later. Some of the guys who are smarter than I am. I bet there are many here. So fine-tuning quantum mechanics and cosmological artificial selection. I would just put that here as a as a hook for this is some discussion later. I guess I'll stop here. I have more things to say, but I'll leave it for tomorrow. Thank you very much.